in New Jersey, and I've just been supervising a study of this, find they're mostly in the upscale communities. They're not developing in the places like Camden and other low-income communities that have been riddled with corruption scandals over the years. So how are we going to get that kind of political accountability? How are we going to get the accountability journalism that has been important to the extent we've been able to have it, of controlling the problem of corruption? Increasingly, the production of news is going to require subsidy. And the question is really from where and under what conditions that subsidy will come. The problems that this challenge raises are very difficult because of the legitimate concern that any subsidy, whether from government or private philanthropy, may induce subservience and dependency in the press. But we should take encouragement from three experiences. First, early in our history, besides guaranteeing freedom of the press in the First Amendment, the federal government aided newspapers through postal policy without impinging on their freedom. As a result of legislation adopted in 1792, newspapers received two distinct subsidies in the early republic: cheap, below-cost rates for sending copies to subscribers, and a franking privilege that allowed newspaper editors to exchange copies with one another through the mails at no postal charge. And these subsidies encouraged the establishment of newspapers throughout the nation on a decentralized basis, and they created a national news network that linked those newspapers together, all without censoring or controlling the content of the news itself. Second, in recent decades, government at both the federal and state levels has supported public broadcasting, which has become an important source of news and public affairs discussion. On radio in particular, as commercial stations have abandoned journalism, the public stations have performed an especially valuable service by continuing to prefer high quality. And besides supporting public service broadcasting, democratic governments elsewhere, particularly in Northern Europe, have successfully used subsidies to maintain competition and diversity in the press, again, without limiting its. The Scandinavian countries have preserved more newspaper competition through subsidies than we did by giving newspapers an antitrust exemption in the Newspaper Preservation Act of 1970, legislation which I think in retrospect was clearly a failure. Today, those countries in Northern Europe have invested public funds in news, have higher levels of newspaper readership and higher levels of civic literacy than we do in the United States. Some of those countries, in fact other countries in Europe as well, also exempt newspapers from the value-added tax, which is another source of subsidy. Still, to avoid any loss of press freedom, any public support for journalism in the United States ought to be approached with great caution, and it seems to me at least three principles should be observed. First, any subsidies must be viewpoint neutral. They can't favor one political view over another. Second, they should be platform neutral. They shouldn't favor print media over online media, for example. And third, they should be neutral, or at least reasonably balanced, as to organizational form. Taken as a whole, they should not favor for-profit over nonprofit organization or vice versa. To be sure, some policies by their nature may benefit one type of organization, but the sum total of policy should be indifferent as to whether the news is provided via a for-profit or a nonprofit enterprise. Nonprofit-supported journalism is already increasing, and many Americans would be more comfortable seeing support for journalism come from a great variety of private philanthropic sources than from government. And to facilitate that development, Congress should seek to remove any legal obstacles that may stand in the way of newspapers receiving tax-exempt support or becoming nonprofit tax-exempt organizations themselves. But we face a new question here. From the founding of the Republic, newspapers have played a central role in politics, endorsing political candidates, for example. It would be a real loss to the tradition of freedom of the press if, in becoming nonprofit, newspapers had to restrict their political expression. I believe, therefore, Congress should consider creating a new category of nonprofit journalistic organizations that are freed from the traditional limitations on political advocacy that apply to normal 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. When Congress originally subsidized newspapers through the postal system, it did not require that they be nonpartisan. In fact, most of them were partisan. Neither should we require newspapers to limit their political expression in order to gain the advantages of nonprofit status. Now, financial support for journalism could take some other forms. You could have, as we do through the public broadcasting system, direct grants. I worry about that because it opens up the potential for manipulation. But we have a structure for public broadcasting that insulates the individual stations from direct political influence. And rather than create an entirely new structure, I think Congress should consider broadening the mandate of the one that exists. After all the distinctions among media, print, broadcast, and so on, are breaking down in the online world. And so Congress could take what we've already got for public broadcasting and make it a more general system for public media. There could also be indirect forms of subsidy. I mentioned that many European countries exempt newspapers from the value-added tax. The equivalent in the United States would be an exemption in whole or part from the payroll tax, with the idea of replacing those contributions to the Social Security trust funds with general revenue. Each one of these raises difficulties, and I don't expect that any of them would be acted on in the short run. But I think it's important to begin considering these alternatives as we look at the future. Now, there are other ways to increase political accountability. We need to have more effective measures for transparency in government. We need to see the role, for example, of the Inspector General strengthened and duplicated in state and local government. But whatever the internal mechanisms for transparency and accountability, there needs to be an independent institution, an independent press, to hold the politicians' feet to the fire. The founders were right, however, to provide concrete assistance to ensure that the press developed and developed throughout the country. We have to figure out how to keep that tradition going in our own time. Thank you.